After 20 years, I have come to say goodbye. France has fallen.
The morning of the 8th of September found the army of Napoleon bivouacked among the dead and wounded on the field of Borodino. Only the guard was really ready for further combat. The corpses of his commanders Davout and Ney were terribly cut up. The 17th, 30th and 106th regiments were nearly destroyed. The cavalry, which had to compensate for Napoleon's comparative weakness in infantry, had suffered fearfully. Nearly all its corps and divisional commanders were killed or wounded. Several regiments were almost annihilated. The 4 corps of the reserves counted some 19,000 men on September the 2nd. On the 20th they could muster little more than 10,000. Thousands of horses had been killed, and there was no present possibility of being able to replace them. While the wounded animals were mostly doomed to perish from lack of forage and proper care, the cavalry of the guard alone was in a state for serious combat. The fate of the wounded was horrible. Means of every kind for tending them were lacking, and fortunate were those whose end was hastened by the incurable nature of their herds, or thirst and starvation. Days elapsed before all had received so much as first aid, and this was but the commencement of their miseries. The great monastery of Koletskoye in the Russian capital became the principal hospital, and in its buildings the victims of Borodino were huddled literally in heaps, without beds even of straw, without food or fire, and without a tenth of the medical aid that was needed. Some of the wounded officers were able to buy food at enormous prices from the convoys which passed these dens of horror. But for the unhappy rank and file, who possessed little or no money, there was no hope. Sanitation there was none, and the unfortunate beings died in the thousands, amid filth, pestilence and neglect. It was said that in one hospital a dead officer was found, who in the agonies of starvation had devoured his own arm to the bone. It is a painful task even to touch upon these sickening details, but to fail to do so is to neglect the primary duty of an historian.
After 20 years, I have come to say goodbye. France has fallen.
When Napoleon's army arrived in Russia, they were soon disappointed. Gloomy forests and sterile soil met the eye. All was sad and silent. After the army had passed the Niemen and entered into Poland, the misery instead of diminishing increased. The hour had struck for these unfortunates. The enemy destroyed everything on retreating. The cattle were taken to distant provinces. The French saw the destruction of the fields. The villages were deserted. The peasants fled upon the appearance of the French army. All inhabitants had left except the Jews. When the army came to Lithuania, everything seemed to be in league against the French. It was a rainy season. The soldiers marched through vast and gloomy forests, and all was melancholy. One could have imagined himself to be in a desert, if it had not been for the vehicles, the cursing of the drivers, discontented on account of hunger and fatigue, the imprecations of the soldiers on every occasion. Bad humor due to privations prevailed everywhere. It would seem as if the furies of hell were marching at the heels of the army. The roads were in a terrible condition, almost unpassable on account of the rain, which had been continuous since the crossing of the Niemen. The artillery wagons especially gave great trouble in passing marches, and on account of the extreme exhaustion of the horses, a great many of these vehicles had to be abandoned. The horses, receiving no nourishment but green herbs, could resist even less than the men, and they fell by the hundreds. The improper feeding of the animals caused gastric disturbances, alternately diarrhea and constipation, enormous tympanitis, peritonitis. It is touching to read of the devotion of German cavalrymen to their poor horses. They would introduce the whole arm into the bowl to relieve the suffering creatures of the accumulated fecal masses. As the army advanced over these roads, the extreme want of provisions was bitterly felt. The warriors, already reduced to such an excess of misery, were exposed to rain without being able to dry themselves. To nourish themselves, they were forced to resort to the most horrible marauding, and sometimes they had nothing to eat for 24 hours or even longer. They run through the land in all directions, disregarding all dangers, sometimes many miles away from the routes, to find provisions. Wherever they came, they went through the houses from the foundation to the roof, and when they found animals, they took them away. No attention was paid to the feelings of the poor peasants, and nothing was considered as being too harsh for them. In most instances, the latter had run away for fear of maltreatment. Nothing is so afflicting as to see the rapacity of pillaging soldiers, stealing and destroying everything coming under their hands. They took to access vodka found in the magazines which the enemy had not destroyed, or in the castles of the main route. In consequence of this abuse of alcohol, while in their feeble condition, many perished. The enemy retreated behind the Duina and fortified himself in camp. It was thought that he would give battle, and all enjoyed this prospect.
After 20 years, I have come to say goodbye. France has fallen.
On July the 20th, at a time when the conditions of the army were already terrible, the heat became excessive. The rain ceased. There were no rainy days, except an occasional storm, until September 17th. The poor infantrymen were too pitied. They had to carry their arms, their effects, their cartridges, harassed by continuous fatigue, overpowered by hunger and thousand sorrows, and were obliged to march 10, 12, 15, and sometimes even 16 and 17 miles a day, over dusty roads under the burning sun, all the time tormented by a cruel thirst. On July 25, a bloody battle was fought near Ostrano. The houses and other buildings of Ostrano were filled with wounded, the battlefield covered with corpses of men and horses, and the hot weather caused quick putrefaction. A Dutch physician in Napoleon's army named Joseph Kerkhoves visited the battlefield on June 28 and says,
I have no words to describe the horror of seeing the unburied cadavers, investing the air, and among the dead many helpless wounded without a drop of water, exposed to the hot sun, crying in rage and despair.
Napoleon made preparations to attack on July 28, but the enemy had retreated. At Vitebsk, hospitals were established for the wounded from Ostrano, among them 800 Russians. However, the designation hospital is hardly applicable, for everything was wanting. The patients in unaffected air, crowded and surrounded by uncleanliness, without food or medicines. These hospitals were in reality dead houses. The physicians did what they could. On August 18, the French army entered Smolensk, which had been destroyed by projectiles and by fire. And in the midst of this desolation, the terror-stricken inhabitants running everywhere, looking for members of their families, many of whom had been killed by bullets or by flames, or sitting before their still smoking homes, tearing their hair. A picture of distress truly heartrending. The soldiers who were the first to enter Smolensk found flour, brandy, and wine, but these things were devoured in an instant. There were 10,000 wounded in the so-called hospitals, and among these unfortunates, typhus and hospital gangrene developed rapidly, the sick lying on the floor without even a straw. A witness gives the following description and says, "After Smolensk had been evacuated by the Russians, most houses had been burned out. The retreating Russians had destroyed everything that could be of any use. Corpses everywhere. Nobody had time to remove them. And the cannons, the freight wagons, the horses, and the infantry passed over them." On August 17th and 18th was the Battle of Polotsk, in which the Bavarians distinguished themselves. There were no medicines for the wounded, not even drinking water, no bread, no salt. Of the many unhealthy places in Russia, this is the worst. It swarms with insects. Nostalgia was prevailing. They had a so-called dying chamber in the hospital for which the soldiers were longing, to rest there on straw, never to rise again.
After 20 years, I have come to say goodbye. France has fallen!
On the 6th of December, the very day after Napoleon's departure of Moscow, the sky exhibited a more dreadful appearance. Icy particles were seen floating in the air, and the birds fell stiff and frozen to the earth. The atmosphere was motionless and silent. It seemed as if everything in nature which possessed life and movement, even the wind itself, had been seized, chained, and as it were congealed by a universal death. Not a word or a murmur was then heard. There was nothing but the gloomy silence of despair, and the tears which proclaimed it. We crept along in the midst of this empire of death-like doomed spirits. The dull and the monotonous sound of our steps, the cracking of the frost, were the only interruptions to this doleful and universal silence. Anger and imprecations there were none, nor anything which indicated a remnant of warmth. Scarcely was strength enough left to utter a prayer, and most of the men fell without even complaining, either from weakness or resignation, or because people complain only when they look for kindness and fancy they are pitied. Sometimes the snow sank beneath their feet, but more frequently, its glassy surface refusing them support. They slipped at every step and tottered along from one fall to another. It seemed as though this hostile soil were leagued against them, that it treacherously escaped from under their efforts, that it was constantly leading them into snares, as if to embarrass and retard their march, and to deliver them up to the Russians in pursuit of them, or to the terrible climate. And in truth, whenever for a moment they halted from exhaustion, the winter laying his icy hand upon them was ready to seize his victims. In vain did these unhappy creatures, feeling themselves benumbed, raise themselves up, and already deprived of the power of speech, and plunged into a stupor, proceed a few steps like automatons. Their blood froze in their veins, like water in the current of rivulets, congealing the heart, and these dying men staggered, as if they had been intoxicated. From their eyes reddened and inflamed by the constant glare of the snow, by the want of sleep and the smoke of the bivouacs, there flowed real tears of blood. Their bosoms heaved with deep and heavy sighs, They looked towards heaven, at us, and on the earth, with an eye dismayed, fixed and wild, as expressive of their farewell, and it might be of their reproaches against the barbarous nature which was tormenting them. It was not long before they fell upon their knees, and then upon their hands. Their heads still slowly moved for a few minutes alternately to the right and the left, and from their open mouths some sounds of agony escaped. At last, they fell flat upon the snow, burying their faces in it, and their sufferings were at an end.